In this video, we're going to sort out some electrical gremlins, including the fuel gauge, which I don't believe is working. There's either a problem with the sender, the wiring, or the cluster itself. The brake lights don't seem to be working. That'll either be the wiring or the brake light switch. And there's an intermittent problem whereby the cluster lights and dash central console lights sometimes come on when you turn the lights on, and sometimes they don't. So we'll be investigating that as well. There are 3 active pins on this fuel sender. This one here has got a G next to it. This one has got a W next to it, and this one has got a T next to it. And this plug is keyed. This here is just a keying pin here, so the plug only fits on one way. Now the first thing we're going to do is we are going to attach these 2 pins together and turn the key 1 click in the ignition. So I'm bridging these 2 pins just with a piece of copper wire, and what we should expect to see is that the fuel gauge reads full. If the fuel gauge reads full when we do that, then we know that there's no problem between the ground and the instrument cluster. So with those 2 pins bridged, I'm expecting to see that fuel gauge shoot all the way up to full when I turn the key 1 click in the ignition. And there you go. As you fill the tank with fuel, a float rises up, and that float is connected to 2 wires, so the resistance is changing, and when that float gets to the top, i.e. you filled the tank up, the resistance is at the minimum and the needle on the gauge is all the way over to the right. If you've got a flickering gauge, it could be either because these terminals here are dirty, or it could be that the actual terminals inside the fuel sender are dirty and you need to clean them, or it could be that you've got a poor earth on the instrument cluster itself. Now, if you need to test whether your reserve light is working and you don't want to go to the hassle of taking out the instrument cluster, what you're going to do is you're going to bridge this top pin here with this pin on the other side here, and once you've done that, when you turn the key 1 click in the ignition, you should see the reserve light come on. So here's our setup. We've bridged those 2 pins. Make sure that that's in there firmly. So with those 2 pins bridged, when I turn the key 1 click in the ignition, that reserve light should come on if the bulb is good or the connections in the cluster are good. And you can see that absolutely nothing is happening, so we need to check the bulb, either that it's connected in there firmly or that it's working at all. To take the cluster out on a Mercedes, you have to take this central piece of trim out, then this nut off, and then the steering wheel will just pull off. Before you ever take the steering wheel off, always make a note of the central bolt relative to the steering wheel so you get it on straight again, either with a piece of white Tipp-Ex or black marker pen. Once you've got the steering wheel off, this cluster will just pull straight out. Now, you can get 2 special Mercedes tools, which are basically thin bits of metal with a hook on the end that slip down there. You twist them and then you pull this towards you. It won't come all the way out because obviously there's a jumble of wires connected. And on the old Mercedes, this is the 1975, the oil pressure gauge is actually connected by a hard oil line. So if you wanted to take this out completely, you have to undo that oil line. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this. There should be a rubber band around the cluster here that holds it tight in here, and you should be able to tilt the cluster around like this without disconnecting anything. This particular cluster is held on here with the speedo cable, and then there's a big plug, electrical plug here, and there's an oil line as well. But what we are concerned at is the bulb right in the bottom, which of course is the most difficult one to get to. This is the reserve light bulb here, and to get it out, you push it in towards the cluster and then upwards and pull it straight out. These bulbs just pull straight out like so, and if you look carefully, you will see there are 2 loops of wire just here and on the other side here. If you want to test this bulb, set your voltmeter to this setting here and just touch each of those 2 sides with the terminals, and what you should see is the reading there changing. If you don't see that reading changing, it means that the bulb is blown and it has infinite resistance. This bulb is blown. If you do find it's your actual fitting that's broken, like this here, You can actually get spare fittings from Euro in America. They don't look exactly the same, but they basically do the same job. So we're going to put a new bulb in here and see if that works. When you are replacing dash bulbs, there are two sizes. There's that size there, and then there's this size here, which are much smaller bulbs, the same principle, push fit bulbs. We've changed the reserve tank bulb with a known good bulb, but when we turn the ignition one click, still nothing. Here's a good idea before you start taking the cluster out, just to disconnect the battery. You can undo this oil line here without oil spurting everywhere, but it's important that you have two spanners. They're two different sizes, one to undo this and the other to hold the fitting on the back here, so that you don't damage the actual board. Next up, we're just going to put a piece of wire in a drill and clean each one of those holes just by holding that wire in and slowly putting the drill on. Do you know, I have spent hours trying to figure out why the fuel light and the fuel gauge isn't working, and I'm starting to wonder whether this is actually wired up incorrectly. The brown on a Mercedes is normally ground, and on the actual fuel sender this pin here is marked as ground, but on the plug it's this pin here. So now the moment of truth, I've hooked those wires up the other way around. Let's see what happens when we turn this on now. We now get the reserve light lit. Right, if my theory is right, then using this spare fuel sender here, if we connect the brown earth wire up to where I think it should be here, and we're collecting the blue to this one and the blue-green to this one, the float is at the bottom, so when we turn the ignition on, we should expect to see that light come on, which we do. I don't know how well you can see that. And similarly, if I turn this upside down now, and this is simulating a full tank, what we'd expect to see now is the needle all the way to the other side, which we do. And one last test would be to put the float halfway down and see if we see a half full tank. I'm going to pick the fuel sender up and see if I can, there you go, shake the float. I'm shaking the fuel sender all the way down and then turning it up the other way, and look at that. So all I was doing during that test is just tilting this back and forward so the float is sliding up and down. Wow, that took me such a long time to figure out. The reason that the reserve light wasn't working and the fuel gauge wasn't reading correctly is simply because somebody has rewired this plug incorrectly, and I bet if you look here you can see that this is actually being joined here. I bet if I cut that back I'll see that these wires are joined here. So all we have to do is wire this up correctly and everything should work. There we go, we've managed to squeeze those wires in without cutting anything. So brown is at the top, blue is at the bottom, and blue-green is on the right hand side. So we've put everything back together. The fuel gauge needle moves. Now I have got about 30 or 40 pounds worth of fuel in here, so I would expect that needle to be much higher than just on reserve, but these cars do have an enormous tank, and it was a new fuel tank that we put in, so the only way to test that would be to the garage and actually fill it up and see if that goes to full. Man, it took me a long time, but I finally figured out why these lights here weren't working and why the under dash lights weren't working. And the reason is our dimmer switch works absolutely fine. I've fixed that in the past. Let me show you what the reason was, or is. The reason is this connector here is not making good connection. If I wiggle this around, there you go, you can see. If I wiggle that around like that, you can see that that's not making a good connection. So what we'll do is undo these two fittings, crimp them together properly and put some heat shrink on there, and that should cure all of our electrical woes. We'll just do this other one here just to tidy this up. Right, that's us done. We just need to click these cables back in here, keep them nice and secure. And I think when we put this back on the car, that is going to work perfectly well. We've got the cluster back in. Let's just see if everything works. Lights are working, indicators are working, hazards are both working. Let's check out the actual lights. Yep, you can see that these lights are now coming on every time, which is good. We're just going to do a quick test to see whether the low brake fluid warning light is working, and the way to do that is to turn the ignition on 2 clicks so the red light is on, and then press this lever down. Let's just quickly check our foot brake or park brake light. That's this one here, and that is working just fine. Another thing that I noticed isn't working on this car is the rear brake lights, i.e. when you put your foot on the brake, that the lights are not coming on, and that is almost certainly a brake light switch issue. So what I've done is I've just unplugged the brake light, bridged the 2 pins, and now when we turn the ignition on, we'll see if the brake lights come on. So the brake lights themselves work, it's just a faulty brake light switch which we can get and replace without problem. Here's the brake switch here. It's just held on with a nut and a washer, and this lower nut here is just to adjust how far it goes in. Now you can see that this is pretty old and knackered, so we'll try and get another one of these, but first we'll just spray some electrical contact cleaner down there to see if we can actually get it working. In the next video, I'm going to be either fitting shock absorbers or replacing a broken cable for the soft top, and doing a thorough video on how that mechanism works, what to do if you can't get your hard roof off or your soft top open or closed, and where to get the various cables from if you need to fix it.